November 14, 1891. Harrow Gap, Eastern Kentucky. 4:47 p.m. Deputy Marshal William Chetwood could not have known, as he dismounted his exhausted mare on the narrow mountain trail, that he was standing less than 200 yards from where 19 men had drawn their last breaths. Behind him, the Cumberland Gap rose like a wall against civilization. Ahead, smoke curled from a single chimney in a valley so remote that the nearest telegraph line ended 43 miles away. Between the two, 7 years of silence had buried questions no one thought to ask. Harrow Gap wasn't marked on official maps until 1894. It didn't need to be. The valley, carved between two steep ridges of the Appalachian Range, was accessible only by a single wagon trail that became impassable during winter snows, typically from late November through March. The nearest settlement, a logging camp called Parthon's Ridge, lay 18 miles north by trail, 3 days by wagon in good weather. The county seat at Pineville was 62 miles distant. In 1885, when the horror began, it might as well have been on another continent. The Harrow family had occupied the valley since 1871. Silas Harrow, a Confederate veteran who'd lost his left hand at Shiloh, had claimed the land under the Homestead Act with his wife, Constance, and their 3 children, Luther, 19, Ezekiel, 16, and Mercy, 14. By all contemporary accounts, they were unremarkable pioneers, taciturn mountain folk who kept to themselves, appeared occasionally at Parthon's Ridge to trade furs and honey for flour and ammunition, and troubled no one. Silas died in the winter of 1883, crushed when a dead oak fell during clearing. Constance followed him 6 months later. Consumption, the traveling doctor from Pineville recorded in his ledger. The children, now adults, continued operating what they called a wilderness hostelry, a rest station for hunters, fur traders, and the occasional surveyor passing through the gap. It was a logical enterprise. The trail through Harrow Gap was the only viable route for travelers moving between the eastern Kentucky settlements and the lucrative fur trading territories further west. In an era when travelers often went weeks between encounters with civilization, a warm cabin offering meals and shelter was more than convenience, it was necessity. The Harrows, it seemed, had found their niche. Thomas Whitmore, a patent medicine salesman from Richmond, Virginia, was likely the first to die, though this would not be confirmed until much later. On October 3, 1885, he stopped at the Harrow cabin, his wagon loaded with bottles of Whitmore's Miracle Tonic for nervous disorders and female complaints. His sales ledger, recovered years later, showed he'd intended to reach Parthon's Ridge by October 5, then continue to Louisville for the autumn trading season. He never arrived at Parthon's Ridge. His wife, Elizabeth Whitmore, filed a missing person report with the Richmond police on November 12, 1885. The report noted that Thomas carried approximately $340 in cash and negotiable notes, equivalent to a year's wages for a skilled tradesman. The Richmond police forwarded the inquiry to Kentucky authorities. It was noted, filed, and forgotten. Men disappeared in the wilderness regularly. The mountains were unforgiving. What no one knew was that Thomas Whitmore's wagon, stripped of its contents, had been pushed into a ravine half a mile from the Harrow cabin. His body, weighted with stones, had been lowered into an abandoned mine shaft that Silas Harrow had dug in 1876, searching for coal seams that never materialized. The shaft, 30 feet deep and carefully hidden beneath deadfall, was dry, dark, and absolutely silent. It would not remain empty for long. Between October 1885 and September 1891, 19 men entered Harrow Gap. 14 were traveling alone. 5 were in pairs. All stopped at the Harrow cabin, either because they'd heard of it from other travelers, or simply because when you saw smoke in the wilderness after days of riding, you stopped. Hospitality was survival in the mountains. You trusted your fellow pioneers because the alternative was death by exposure, starvation, or accident. The Harrows understood this trust. They cultivated it carefully. Luther Harrow, by 1885, was a massive man, 6 feet 4 inches, 240 pounds, with his father's broad shoulders and a reputation as an exceptional hunter. Traders at Parthen's Ridge described him as quiet, but mannerly enough. He always paid in coin, never notes or credit. He never drank, never gambled, never caused trouble. Ezekiel, 2 years younger, was the thinker. Lean where Luther was broad, he kept meticulous records of the family's honey production, fur catches, and supply needs. The ledgers he brought to trading posts were models of frontier bookkeeping. Several merchants remarked on his penmanship, unusual for a mountain dweller with minimal formal education. Mercy Harrow, youngest of the three, appeared rarely in public. The few accounts that exist describe her as plain-featured, strong-built, and given to long silences. She wore her mother's old dresses, faded but clean. Her hands, traders noticed, were calloused and powerful, unusual even for a farm woman accustomed to hard labor. What none of these observers realized was that the Harrows' increasing prosperity, the silver coins they paid with, the quality of the supplies they purchased, the new rifle Luther bought in 1888, came not from honey or furs, but from a systematized process of robbery and murder that they had refined over 6 years into something approaching routine. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. A traveler would arrive, usually late afternoon or evening. The Harrows would offer food and shelter, 50 cents for a meal, $2 for a bed in their barn loft. The traveler would accept, grateful for civilization in the wilderness. Mercy would prepare the meal. And in that meal, dissolved in coffee or stew, would be a careful measure of laudanum, the opium-based medicine available in any frontier store, used for everything from toothaches to surgical anesthesia. The dosage was precise. Not enough to render the victim immediately unconscious, that would cause alarm. Just enough to induce profound drowsiness within 30 to 40 minutes. The traveler would attribute it to exhaustion, the warm fire, the heavy meal. They would retire to the barn loft, or occasionally to a small sleeping room in the cabin itself. They would never wake up. By November 1891, the Harrows had accumulated an estimated $4,200 in cash, 19 horses, sold gradually at different trading posts across 3 counties, 8 firearms, 4 gold watches, numerous tools, supplies, and personal effects ranging from wedding rings to surveying equipment. They had also become expert at disposal. The old mine shaft held 12 bodies. 7 more had been weighted and lowered into a natural sinkhole 3 miles south of the cabin, a limestone depression filled with water so dark and deep that local hunters claimed it was bottomless. The Harrows knew it was exactly 63 feet deep. They'd measured. But systems, no matter how carefully designed, contain flaws. And in the autumn of 1891, the Harrow system was about to encounter a flaw they hadn't anticipated, a man who refused to die quietly. Deputy Marshal William Chetwood was not supposed to be investigating disappearances. At 47 years old, with a bullet-shattered knee from the Battle of Perryville and a disposition that frontier life had worn to flint, he was supposed to be retiring. His jurisdiction, the vast, undermapped eastern counties of Kentucky, was being subdivided. Younger marshals, men who'd never smelled gunpowder except at turkey shoots, were taking over. But Chetwood had a gift that 23 years of frontier law enforcement had honed to instinct. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. It began with a widow's letter. In March 1891, Sarah Donovan wrote to the U.S. Marshal's office in Louisville. Her husband, Patrick Donovan, had left their home in Lexington in September 1890, intending to reach the fur trading posts near the Tug Fork River. He'd expected to return by Christmas. It was now March. No word. No body. No closure. The letter would have been filed with the dozens of similar inquiries the marshal's office received annually. Wilderness was dangerous. Men disappeared, except for one detail that caught Chetwood's attention. Patrick Donovan's planned route took him through Harrow Gap. Chetwood pulled the missing persons files for eastern Kentucky. It took 3 days of sorting through reports from 6 different counties, some handwritten, some typed, many water-stained or incomplete. He spread them across his office floor, organized by date and location. 13 missing men between 1886 and 1891. All traveling west. All last confirmed seen somewhere east of Harrow Gap. None confirmed seen west of it. It could have been coincidence. The mountains between the gap and the western settlements were brutal. Cliffs, caves, rapid rivers. Men fell. Men got lost. Men encountered bears, wildcats, or simply bad weather and bad luck. But 13 men? Over 5 years? All on the same general route? Chetwood requested additional files from Tennessee and Virginia. 2 more names emerged: James Hartley, 1887, Virginia, and Samuel Colton, 1889, Tennessee. Both had mentioned, in letters to family, their intention to stop at a cabin in the Gap that offered lodging. 15 men. Same route. Same rough timeline. Same vanishing point. On April 3, 1891, Chetwood requisitioned a horse and supplies from the marshal's office and rode for Harrow Gap. It took him 4 days, sleeping in his bedroll, eating hardtack and dried venison, following the increasingly narrow trail that wound through gaps in the limestone ridges. He arrived at the Harrow cabin on April 7th, late afternoon. Luther Harrow answered his knock. The man was enormous. Chetwood, himself 6 feet tall, found himself looking up. But Luther's manner was courteous, almost gentle. Yes, they occasionally hosted travelers. Yes, they'd welcome the deputy marshal for the night. 50 cents for supper, $2 for a bed in the loft. Chetwood paid. He watched. The cabin was clean, almost fastidiously so. The floor, rough-hewn planks, showed recent scrubbing. The walls bore no decoration except a single-framed tintype of what Chetwood assumed were the parents, stern-faced people in Sunday clothes. A shelf held a dozen books, mostly religious texts. A large cookstove dominated one wall, well-maintained and clearly much used. Mercy prepared the meal: venison stew, cornbread, coffee. She worked in silence, never meeting Chetwood's eyes. Her hands, he noticed, bore old scars across the knuckles. Burn scars, he assumed, from years of cooking. Ezekiel joined them for the meal. He was talkative where his siblings were quiet, asking Chetwood about news from Pineville, about politics, about whether the railroad would ever reach this far into the mountains. He seemed genuinely educated, using words that surprised Chetwood coming from a frontier dweller. The coffee was strong and dark. Chetwood drank it, and felt nothing. Whether by chance or by some survival instinct that 23 years of danger had bred into his bones, Chetwood had eaten little of the stew. His scarred knee throbbed in damp weather, and heavy meals made it worse. The coffee he'd sipped politely but not finished. When drowsiness should have come, he felt only the normal fatigue of a long ride. He excused himself to the barn loft, climbed the ladder, spread his bedroll, and waited. Midnight passed. The cabin below remained lit. He could see the glow through gaps in the barn's floorboards. He heard voices, too low to distinguish words, but clearly the 3 siblings in conversation long after visitors should have been asleep. At 1:30 a.m., he heard the cabin door open. Footsteps approached the barn. Chetwood lay perfectly still, breathing with the deep, regular rhythm of sleep. The barn door creaked. Someone climbed the ladder slowly, carefully. Chetwood's hand found the grip of his Colt .45, hidden beneath his blanket. A figure appeared at the top of the ladder, Luther, carrying a length of rope. He approached Chetwood's bedroll, reached down toward the sleeping man's throat. Chetwood's revolver pressed against Luther's stomach. "Don't move," Chetwood said quietly. 4-5 frozen seconds. Neither man breathed. Then Luther stepped backward, hands rising slowly. "Marshal," he said, "you're mistaken. I was just checking." "Checking what?" "Whether I was dead yet." Luther's face remained impassive. "You should leave. Morning. First light. I intend to. After I search this property." "You have no warrant." "I have a badge and a gun." In these mountains, that's warrant enough. Luther descended the ladder. Chetwood didn't sleep. At dawn, he saddled his horse and departed, Luther watching from the cabin door. But Chetwood didn't ride for Pineville. He rode 3 miles east, then circled back through the forest, tethered his horse in a ravine, and approached the Harrow property on foot. He spent 2 days watching. He saw Ezekiel ride out, return with supplies from Parthon's Ridge. He saw Mercy working in a small garden. He saw Luther disappear into the woods with a shovel, return 90 minutes later without it. On the 3rd day, Chetwood followed Luther's path. It led to a depression in the forest floor, carefully camouflaged with dead branches and leaves. Chetwood cleared the covering. Beneath was a mine shaft opening, secured with a new wooden cover. He lifted it. The smell that emerged made him step back, gagging. He returned to Pineville on April 12, 1891. He filed a formal report with the U.S. Marshal's Office requesting federal intervention. He was specific. I have probable cause to believe that 3 occupants of property in Harrow Gap, Kentucky, have systematically murdered travelers over a period of no less than 5 years. Request immediate assistance for search and apprehension. The response came in May. Denied. Insufficient evidence. No bodies. No witnesses. No jurisdiction for federal intervention in what might be a local law enforcement matter. Chetwood appealed. He wrote letters to county sheriffs, to newspapers, to the governor's office. Most ignored him. A few wrote back with variations of the same message. Men disappear in mountains. That's wilderness. Bring me a body, then we'll talk. He couldn't get a body. Not without help. Not without legal authority to conduct a full search. And the bureaucracy moved with the speed of glaciers. By September 1891, 7 months had passed. Chetwood had been forced into official retirement. The subdivision of his jurisdiction was complete. He had no badge, no authority, no resources. But he still had his certainty. And his rifle. He was preparing to return to Harrow Gap, alone, unauthorized, old and scarred but still capable, when everything changed. On September 19, 1891, a man staggered into Parthon's Ridge. He was barefoot, his clothes torn and filthy, his wrists raw with rope burns. He collapsed in front of the trading post, muttering 2 words before losing consciousness. Harrow Gap. The man was Daniel Foster, and he had been dead in the mine shaft for 3 days before clawing his way out of hell. Daniel Foster should not have been alive. Dr. Marcus Webb, the circuit physician who examined Foster in Parthon's Ridge, documented injuries and conditions inconsistent with short-term survival. Severe dehydration, rope burns that had begun to ulcerate, multiple contusions suggesting a fall of at least 20 feet, 2 broken fingers on his left hand, and early stages of sepsis from an infected leg wound. Most telling were his pupils, contracted to pinpoints despite the dim light of the trading post's backroom, indicating recent exposure to opiates. This man, Dr. Webb wrote in his medical journal, was drugged, bound, and thrown into a confined space. He survived through circumstances I cannot fully explain, likely involving shallow water, slowed metabolism from the opium, and what can only be called miraculous constitution. Foster's testimony, given in fragments over 3 days as fever racked him, revealed the systematic nature of the Harrow family's operation. Daniel Foster, 32 years old, was a timber surveyor from Pittsburgh. On September 12, 1891, he'd arrived at the Harrow cabin near sunset, grateful for the smoke rising from the chimney. He'd been riding for 6 days, mapping potential lumber tracts for a Philadelphia investment company. His saddlebags contained surveying equipment, maps, notebooks, and $280 in cash, payment for his summer's work. Mercy Harrow had served him stew and coffee. He remembered thinking the coffee tasted bitter, but mountain coffee often did. He remembered feeling drowsy, attributing it to exhaustion. He remembered thanking Luther for showing him to the barn loft. He remembered nothing else until he woke in absolute darkness, cold water soaking his legs, his head throbbing with pain that felt like his skull was splitting open. His hands were bound behind his back with rope. His ankles were similarly tied. He was lying on something hard and rough, stone, he realized. He called out. His voice echoed strangely, suggesting an enclosed space. No answer came. He had no sense of how long he remained there. Hours, certainly. Possibly a day or more. The darkness was total, not the darkness of night, where eyes adjust and shapes emerge, but the absolute absence of light that exists only underground. He heard water dripping. He heard once what sounded like something heavy being dragged across stone above him, but far above, muffled by earth. The water was both salvation and torment. It pooled in depressions in the rock floor. By twisting his body and lowering his face, Foster could lap at it like an animal. It tasted of minerals and earth but was likely what kept him alive. The opiates in his system, while initially incapacitating, may have also slowed his metabolism, reducing his body's demand for food and warmth. On what he estimated was the second day, he heard voices above. Distant, indistinct, but definitely human. He screamed for help until his throat bled. The voices stopped. Silence returned. Desperation breeds innovation. Foster spent hours, he had nothing but time, working his bound wrists against a sharp edge of rock he'd located by feel. The rope was thick and well knotted, but stone is patient. After what felt like an eternity but was likely 8 to 10 hours, the rope frayed enough that he could pull his hands free. His fingers were numb, his wrists bleeding, but he could move them. He untied his ankles. Stood. Immediately fell, his legs unable to support him after so long in restraint. He crawled, feeling the walls. Stone. Rough. The space was roughly circular, perhaps 8 feet across. He found what felt like an opening on one side, not a door, but a narrow passage, perhaps 3 feet high. He crawled through it. The passage extended perhaps 20 feet, then opened into another chamber. This one was larger. And it was not empty. Foster's hands, exploring blindly, touched fabric. Then something harder beneath the fabric. Buttons. And beneath that, the unmistakable geometry of a human rib cage. He recoiled, crawling backward until his back hit stone. For several minutes he simply breathed, trying not to vomit, trying not to lose his mind in the darkness with the dead. But horror can be overcome by the will to survive. Foster forced himself forward again. If there was a body, there might be items. Tools. Something he could use. He found 3 bodies in that chamber. All in various stages of decomposition. The smell should have told him, but his nose had stopped registering it, overwhelmed into numbness. He searched them methodically, fighting revulsion. He found nothing useful. No tools. No weapons. Just cloth and bone and the peculiar emptiness of death. But he found something else, a draft. Air moving. Barely perceptible, but in absolute darkness, you notice things you'd miss in light. He followed the draft. It led to another narrow passage, this one angling upward. The climb was nightmarish. The passage was barely wide enough for his shoulders. In places he had to push himself forward with his toes, arms extended ahead, the stone, scraping his back and chest. Twice he became wedged and had to exhale completely to narrow his chest enough to continue. The darkness pressed on him like physical weight. He climbed for what felt like hours. Later, Dr. Webb estimated the shaft Foster had been thrown into was approximately 30 feet deep, and the passage he climbed was perhaps 50 feet long at a steep angle, roughly equivalent to climbing a 4-story building through a chimney. He felt fresh air before he saw light. The passage narrowed further, became nearly vertical. He pushed upward, his broken fingers screaming, and his hand broke through into open air. It was night above ground. He'd been in the shaft for 3 days. He pulled himself through an opening barely 18 inches wide, later identified as an old ventilation shaft from the mine's original construction. He collapsed on the forest floor, unable to move for perhaps 2 hours. When he could stand, he walked. He had no idea which direction. His boots had been removed while he was unconscious. His feet bled. He fell repeatedly. But he walked. He reached Parthon's Ridge at dawn on September 19th. William Chetwood received word of Foster's survival on September 20th via telegram forwarded from Pineville. He was in Louisville, still fighting bureaucracy for authorization to investigate Harrow Gap. Foster's testimony changed everything. By September 22nd, Chetwood had federal authority, 6 U.S. Marshals, the county sheriff, and 12 armed deputies. They rode for Harrow Gap in a column that kicked up dust visible for miles. The Harrow cabin was empty when they arrived on September 24th. The door stood open. The interior was neat, organized, unremarkable. The stove was cold. No sign of hurried departure, no sign of violence. Just an empty cabin in a silent valley. Luther Harrow was found 4 hours later, hanging from a white oak tree 200 yards from the cabin. The rope around his neck was the same type he'd carried when approaching Chetwood in the barn loft 5 months earlier. No note. No explanation. Just a massive man swaying in autumn wind. Ezekiel Harrow was found in the barn. He'd cut his own throat with a straight razor, sitting at the small desk where he'd kept his meticulous ledgers. The last entry, dated September 19th, read simply, "Man escaped. It is finished. God forgive us." Mercy Harrow was never found. Searchers spent 2 weeks combing the forest. They found no trace. The prevailing theory was that she'd fled deeper into the mountains, possibly to die of exposure, possibly to disappear into some other remote settlement. A second theory, darker and never proven, was that her brothers had disposed of her body before taking their own lives, that she'd wanted to continue, that she'd argued against suicide, and that in their final hours Luther and Ezekiel had made a choice. The ledgers Ezekiel left behind documented everything. Not the murders, he was too careful for that, but the goods. Horses sold. Equipment disposed of. Cash accumulated and spent. Cross-referencing with missing persons reports, authorities could trace 19 men whose possessions matched items in Ezekiel's records. The search of the property took 6 days. They found the mine shaft on September 25th. The smell guided them to it. Even through the wooden cover, even 30 feet deep, death has a presence that draws flies and alerts anyone with experience. Marshal Jackson Hardy descended first, with rope and lantern. He climbed back up 14 minutes later, vomited, and refused to speak for an hour. When he finally did, his report was clinical: 12 bodies, various states of decomposition. The oldest appear to be several years deceased. The newest appear to be weeks old, possibly the surveyor Foster. Conditions indicate bodies were stripped of valuables and simply dumped. Dr. Webb supervised the recovery. It took 2 full days. The bodies were brought up one by one, laid out on canvas in a field near the cabin. Identification was difficult. Clothing, when it had survived, provided some clues. Personal effects: a wedding ring engraved "To James, 1885," a pocket watch with initials P.D. provided more. 11 bodies were eventually identified. 9 families received remains for burial. 8 bodies remained unknown. The sinkhole was located on September 27th, following a rough map found in Ezekiel's desk. It was exactly where he'd marked it, 3 miles south, hidden in a limestone depression. The water was dark, cold, and impossibly deep-looking. They lowered weighted lines. At 63 feet, exactly as Ezekiel had noted in margins of his map, the weight hit something solid. Retrieving bodies from that depth, in 1891, was impossible. The decision was made to leave them entombed in their water grave. But the most disturbing discovery came on September 28th, in a root cellar beneath the cabin that searchers had initially missed. The entrance was hidden under a heavy rug and required 3 men to lift the door. The cellar was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10. It contained shelves of preserved food, sacks of flour and sugar, and a locked wooden chest. The chest contained money, $3,847 in currency and coin. It contained jewelry, watches, rings, lockets, cufflinks. It contained documents, letters addressed to men who'd disappeared, receipts, identification papers. And it contained something else. A diary. 73 pages in Mercy Harrow's cramped handwriting. The diary was not confessional. It was practical. It documented dosages. Half teaspoon in coffee renders man of 180 pounds insensate within 40 minutes. It documented methods. Rope should be wetted before binding to prevent escape through shrinkage. It documented disposal. Mine shaft most efficient for quantities. Sinkhole for those requiring immediate removal. Most chilling was the tone. There was no guilt, no rationalization, no attempt to justify. Just practicality, like a farmer's journal documenting crop yields. The final entry, dated September 18th, 1 day before Foster escaped, read, "Surveyor woke early. Luther panicked and dropped him before full unconsciousness. Error will require correction if he survives. 20 feet should be sufficient. He had $280 and quality equipment. Total profit this season, $1,240. The diary never mentioned names of victims. Just the traveler, or the surveyor, or the man with the wagon. They were resources, nothing more. Daniel Foster lived 4 more years. Dr. Webb's journals document a man destroyed by survival. The physical wounds healed, even the infected leg wound, though it left Foster with a permanent limp. The psychological wounds never did. He returned to Pittsburgh in October 1891, carried most of the way by family who traveled to Kentucky to retrieve him. He never worked as a surveyor again. He took a position as a bookkeeper for a coal company, indoor work that required no travel. He married in 1893, a brief union that ended after 18 months when his wife, according to divorce papers, could no longer endure his nightly terrors and refusal to sleep in darkness. He died in January 1895, age 36. The death certificate listed cause as accidental laudanum overdose. His landlord found him in his room, an empty bottle of the opiate beside him. Whether it was accident, suicide, or some compulsion to return to the darkness by chemical means, no one could say. The Harrow Gap property was burned on October 3, 1891, by order of the county sheriff. Over 200 locals attended, not as spectators, but as participants. Every structure was destroyed. The cabin, the barn, the shed, all reduced to ash and charred timber. The mine shaft was filled with stone and earth, then covered with timber and set ablaze, collapsing the shaft in controlled demolition that required 2 days and left a crater 30 feet across. The sinkhole was marked with a stone cairn and a wooden sign that read simply, 7 souls. Unknown. 1885 to 1891. The sign rotted away within 5 years. The cairn remains to this day, though few know its meaning. The property itself was never resold, never redeveloped, never touched. It reverted to federal ownership in 1903 and was eventually incorporated into the Daniel Boone National Forest in 1937. The land is public now, but it remains empty. Trees grow where the cabin stood. Undergrowth covers the filled mine shaft. Hikers occasionally pass through without knowing they're walking over ground that held 19 murders. The case changed law enforcement procedures throughout Kentucky and neighboring states. It established the first interstate missing persons coordination, a system requiring sheriffs to report long-term disappearances to a central registry, allowing pattern recognition across jurisdictions. It led to mandatory documentation of lodging establishments in remote areas, though enforcement was nearly impossible in the vast mountain wilderness. Most significantly, it shattered the assumption of frontier hospitality. After the Harrow revelations, traveling the backcountry became an exercise in paranoia. Isolated cabins that once represented safety became potential death traps. The unspoken code of wilderness survival, that you trusted fellow pioneers because the alternative was death, was broken. Some argued this made the frontier more dangerous, as legitimate travelers found fewer people willing to offer shelter. Others argued it simply made survival more honest. Trust had always been a gamble. Now people simply admitted it. William Chetwood received no official commendation. Federal records acknowledge his investigation, but bureaucracy has a way of protecting itself. The official reports focus on Foster's escape and subsequent federal action, minimizing the 7 months Chetwood spent fighting for authorization. He returned to Louisville, spent his final years as a security consultant for railroad companies, and died in 1904, age 60. His gravestone in Cave Hill Cemetery makes no mention of Harrow Gap. The 19 victims represented in Ezekiel's ledgers were Thomas Whitmore, 1885, Patrick Donovan, 1890, James Hartley, 1887, Samuel Colton, 1889, Robert Jenkins, 1886, Michael O'Brien, 1886, Henry Caldwell, 1887, David Morrison, 1888, Charles Webb, unrelated to the doctor, 1888, Joseph Brennan, 1889, William Scott, 1890, George Patterson, 1890, Albert Stevens, 1891, Daniel Foster, survived, 1891, and 5 men whose identities were never confirmed, known only by objects recorded in Ezekiel's ledgers: man with silver watch, 1886, man with surveying tools, 1887, tobacco merchant, 1889, wagon with patent medicine, possibly a second salesman, 1890, and man with gold teeth, 1891. 11 families received remains for burial. 8 bodies remain in the sinkhole. The 5 unknown men remain unknown. Their families, if they existed, never connected them to Harrow Gap, or perhaps never reported them missing at all. The Harrow siblings' graves were never marked. Luther and Ezekiel were buried in unmarked plots at a pauper's cemetery outside Pineville. Mercy, if she died in the wilderness as most believe, was never found. If she escaped to start a new life somewhere else, she vanished completely. The total accumulated profit from 7 years of systematic murder was $4,200 in cash and approximately $2,000 worth of horses, equipment, and goods sold gradually across 3 states. 19 men died for an average of $326 each, less than a year's wages for a laborer. In 1891 dollars. In human terms, immeasurable. Harrow Gap remains today exactly as Ezekiel's last ledger entry described it, a narrow valley between 2 ridges, accessible by a trail that still becomes impassable in winter. The coordinates appear on USGS maps: 36.7042 degrees north, 83.2519 degrees west, but the name Harrow Gap does not. Local maps call it Lost Creek Valley. Ranger stations in Daniel Boone National Forest maintain no records of the site's history. You can hike there if you know where to go. You'll find nothing. Just trees and silence and a stone cairn that tells you nothing about what happened beneath your feet. But the lessons remain, written in blood and earth and bureaucratic files gathering dust in Kentucky County archives. Isolation does not create evil. It only gives evil the space to operate beyond observation and consequence. Hospitality, that fundamental human virtue, becomes weaponized when one party understands that trust is a weakness others cannot afford to abandon. And evil is not, as frontier people wanted to believe, something that arrives from elsewhere, an outsider, a stranger, a corrupting force descending on innocence. Evil is choice, repeated daily, systematized, rationalized not through elaborate philosophy but through the simple, terrible efficiency of routine. The mountains still keep their secrets. And some secrets, even when excavated and documented and understood, never fully release their grip on the places where they were born. 19 men entered Harrow Gap. 18 died there. One survived to live 4 more years in darkness he could never escape. The gap itself remains empty, silent, waiting for no one. Because the horror of Harrow Gap was never supernatural. It was simply human, and that makes it worse. Ghosts can be disbelieved. But the capacity for ordinary people in isolated places to transform hospitality into murder for pocket change and pocket watches, that's documented. That's real. And that's why, even now, hikers who find themselves on that trail as sunset approaches and see smoke rising from a distant valley, keep walking.